As for how much of a change it should be, they thought it was best to do a study to figure that out. Uber and Lyft, since last year, have said, yo, if this bill passes, bye. As someone who is in charge of the government facilitation of your city or state, I think it is important to make decisions based off of having as much information as possible. We're saying that this is the minimum that they would get, and I think that's a good place. It's not even the governor saying he supports this. It's Uber saying they support this. I don't know what kind of cars they're driving. I feel like they're driving Bentleys out there. There are two cities that have implemented a minimum wage floor that I want to look at. One is Seattle and one is New York. Every action has a reaction. We need to stop pretending like it doesn't. And that's why I'm upset with some of these council members.
Last week, I worked 72 hours and made $477.
So this is from the Minnesota Reformer, and it's titled Minneapolis Passes Uber and Lyft Minimum Pay Ordinance with a veto-proof majority. But before I get started, I want to give a disclaimer. Just because I'm about to talk about what I think will happen doesn't mean that that's what I want to happen. So don't think that I'm on Team Uber or I'm on Team Lyft or I'm on Team Minneapolis or I'm on Team Driver or I'm on Team that just because I think something will happen. So I want to start with that. Ignoring threats that Uber and Lyft will pull out of Minneapolis and perhaps the entire state, the Minneapolis City Council passed an ordinance hiking driver pay with a veto-proof 9-4 vote on Thursday. I don't think it's veto-proof. Take that with a grain of salt because it's already been vetoed. Mayor Jacob Frey said ahead of the vote that he would veto the ordinance just as he did last year when the council passed an ordinance with the same pay rates of $1.40 per mile and 51 cents per minute, plus increases alongside the city minimum wage. Since then, voters have elected a large progressive majority capable of overriding the mayor. And it's important for me to give you a quick recap of what has happened up until this moment, because this happened last week, and it's very important to know the backstory, because not knowing the backstory can shape your opinion to be different than knowing the backstory. Initially, the governor or the mayor, they vetoed this wage change because they wanted to have more time to do a study in order to figure out what the increases should be. So the mayor slash governor, both of them, they both agree that there does need to be a change. As for how much of a change it should be, they thought it was best to do a study to figure that out. I agree with that. As someone who is in charge of the government facilitation of your city or state, I think it is important to make decisions based off of having as much information as possible. And as a rideshare driver, I can understand why you don't feel that way. You want as much money as possible. Like, I get that. That's human nature. But responsibly speaking, I think it's acceptable that they should wait on a study. Not a huge fan of government, generally speaking. They can be deceptive and take advantage of people, but I think it's fair to make decisions based off of data instead of decisions based off of arbitrary feelings. Let's continue. The mayor and his allies on the council urged the majority to delay the vote for 2 weeks since the State Department of Labor and Industry is set to release a first of its kind report on Friday. So it is important to notice or to realize that the vote was done the day before the state was set to release that information. To me, this is very, very similar to how Biden decided to give out stimulus checks right before primaries. They're essentially buying our votes or trying to control the narrative. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it per se, but you have to distinguish what's happening. The council decided to vote the day before information was going to be released about what wages, look like and what they should be. I think that if you're on the council and you want to increase the wages, that's a good play. It's a good chess move. They're playing chess, not checkers. And what it does is it allows the public to see who's playing where, right? By having the vote before the study comes out, you're allowing people to draw lines in the sand about what side they stand on before the information comes out. So very smart move by them, but very important to understand that they could have waited a week. So the study analyzes all 19 million trips taken on the two apps in Minnesota in 2022. 2023 would be better data because things can change so drastically year to year. So they do get negatively pinged for that. The council did agree to push back the effective date of the ordinance, if enacted, 1 month to May 1st to give other companies time to enter the market should Uber and Lyft pull out. So if you're just kind of jumping into what's happening, Uber and Lyft, since last year, have said, yo, if this bill passes, bye. And they have done this before. They did this in Austin, but they eventually came back. Now, the MOLDA, which is the name of the organization that's pushing these driver ordinance pays and whatever, they have said that they have other companies lined up if Uber and Lyft skedaddle, right? I have a cynical side in me where I want to see how all of this plays out just to observe it. But real people's lives are at risk here. Their income is at risk. So, I have to sideline that cynical side of me. But to me, it's just they're playing chicken. That's what it feels like. If the Mulder Group have people or companies, entities that will replace Uber and Lyft in a heartbeat, instead of forcing Uber and Lyft to try and pay you more, why not just start working with them? Why not just start making them the primary entity in the region? I know there's gonna be challenges to face with that, but if those companies are so great, then just work with them now. Start building up that presence now instead of waiting until May. I don't know, maybe they feel like it'll weaken their bargaining chips, which in my brain it should do the opposite. It should strengthen their bargaining chips. So to me, it kind of just feels like chicken. Originally, the ordinance was going to go into effect in April 1st, but Uber and Lyft has said they would leave if the mayor or governor didn't veto it. So I think it's playing chicken. I think they're all full of talk. I think there's a degree of talk from Uber and Lyft too. So so from both parties. So I think both parties are just playing chicken. The ordinance lead author, Councilmember Robin Wansley, said there was no reason to delay passing the ordinance itself and urged her colleagues to press on. Rip the Band-Aid off, just do it. Disagree. There is a perfect reason to delay passing the ordinance by at least a week. If it doesn't even go into effect until April, March, May, until May, because they moved it back a month, you should wait. A bipartisan person would wait, have the information. And I'm going to show you some of the information, and they should have just waited, but we'll get to that in a second. Eid Ali, president of the Minnesota Uber Lyft Drivers Association, that's what MULD stands for, MULD. He was on the Rideshare Guys podcast 2 weeks ago. He heralded the vote, saying it was a long time coming for drivers who've long complained of meager and unpredictable wages. It was absolutely a great day. It was a historic day. It's a day we've been waiting for quite some time, Ali said. Drivers have been pressing lawmakers for more than a year to enact minimum pay standards, and they celebrated victory twice before, only to face disappointment. So, personal opinion. I think that if Uber and Lyft are left unchecked, it can get real bad. We've seen the trend that they're decreasing pay over time in certain markets. Just because I'm doing well in my market doesn't mean I assume everyone's doing well in their market, but there does need to be some level of regulation. And I'm not a big fan of government intervention. Too much government intervention usually creates new problems that were not foreseen by those who wanted the intervention. I do think a minimum pay standard should be in place for certain large cities. I just don't necessarily agree with how much that they're asking for or that they wanted. So I'll say that up front, but we'll talk more about that in a second. First, Government Tim Walz vetoed a minimum wage bill after Uber threatened to curtail services. Walz ordered the Department of Labor and Industry to conduct a study and create a task force of drivers and company representatives and stakeholders to make recommendations. I think this is good. This is a good decision. Now, people can still manipulate things like this depending on their agenda. But let's assume, Tim is a good guy. He just wants the best for everyone involved, because the people that live in his state aren't just rideshare drivers. They're also people who take rideshare. I'm just give me as much information as possible before making a decision. Then came Frey veto in August after Lyft threatened to pull out of the city. Finally, the governor's task force adjourned without making a recommendation on minimum pay in December. Uber and Lyft on Thursday renewed their threats to pull out of Minneapolis passenger service if the ordinance takes effect. Uber's delivery service, Uber Eats, is not covered by the ordinance and will not be affected. Man, my cynicism here is saying that if this happens and it's just Uber Eats in there, Uber Eats is going to be super oversaturated. It'll be interesting to watch. Uber said it supported a statewide guarantee of $35 an hour earnings for the state's roughly 7,300 drivers, and Lyft also urged a statewide policy. It doesn't make it clear here, but I'm assuming that is based on active time. So that means the time spent from when you get a ride to when you pick up a passenger and drop off a passenger. That's what they're saying would be $35 an hour minimum. I think that's on the surface, I think that's okay if your market isn't saturated. If you're spending a lot of time, this is why having access to online time versus active time is important and not just looking at active time. Because if I'm online for 10 hours and all right, let me pull the calculator out. It'll make more sense with the calculator. Okay, so I'm online for 10 hours. And out of that 10 hours, I'm only active for 5 hours. So 5 times 35, that would be $175 for 5 hours of active time. But if we divide that number by 10, right? For the 10 hours that I was online for, I only made $17.50 per hour for time that I was actively trying to work, you know? Like I'm online looking for rides, but if there's a huge downtime, then this is gonna suck. Now, if drivers figure out how to make their active time as close to their online time as possible, that $35 is fantastic. I made more than that this week, but during a slow period, that's a fantastic number. I think, and that's minimum, right? We're not saying that's the maximum that they're gonna make. We're saying that this is the minimum that they would get. And I think that's a good place. It's not even the governor saying he supports this. It's Uber saying they support this. I think this is very fair and very reasonable. For the second time in less than a year, the bill sponsors have willingly chosen to ignore offers to collaborate instead of choosing to rush through the most extreme figures possible. We implore Mayor Frey to veto this legislation and instead join our effort to pass a statewide minimum earnings standard that can balance the needs of all Lyft, spokesman CJ McKinley said in a statement. So as I'm reading this, so far, I'm kind of on the side of the government here. They're being reasonable, which is shocking in my brain. The two companies have also rolled out policies in the past year aimed at quelling dissatisfaction from their drivers and impatience from lawmakers. For example, Uber and Lyft now guarantee drivers earn at least $5 on every ride in Minneapolis, and Lyft said it committed to paying drivers at least 70% of what riders pay on a weekly basis after external fees. I will quickly address this. If you have not heard me rant about 70%, I won't do it very long, but the 70% thing, we don't know what external fees is. It could be arbitrary. They say majority of it goes to insurance, but they don't break down what external fees actually are, and it's problematic. So yeah, sure, they're giving 70% to drivers after external fees, but in their own press release, they said only less than 15% of drivers made less than that in 2023. It's just PR. Sure, it's great that you're helping raise the floor by 15%, not that much, but they knew what they were doing. They put this out a couple weeks before they knew this was happening. They just want to make this a talking point. This is more PR related than it is to actually change related. Now, I am happy that they're giving us more information. Don't get me wrong. Like I said, more information is always better, but they're not giving us the information that's really important. Like you're blaming external fees, but you're not telling us the breakdown of those external fees. So just want to talk about that. Councilmember Jamal Osman, who co-authored the ordinance, said passing it was a matter of protecting immigrant workers. I keep seeing this and I don't understand the correlation, but let's continue. We have heard the fear of Uber leaving and the world is going to end. Osman said during Thursday's hearing, it is okay to use the cheap labor of the immigrant community. Are we okay that Uber is staying if they continue to use the cheap labor on the back of the immigrant community? Is he saying that like they're able to keep prices low because immigrants who come here don't mind it? Is that what he's saying? Is majority of the drivers immigrants? Like, I feel like there is some political push that's going on behind the scene to turn this into an immigrant thing. I do know that there are some immigrant factors that are playing a role in some communities, not specifically Minnesota, but there are some immigrant places that accounts are being sold to illegal immigrants and they're just taking whatever. It's not fair that people who aren't the people who the apps say they are doing things. I think that needs to be addressed. But I think it's a far cry to use immigrants as the as the poster boy for this issue. The poster person for this issue is anyone who's an American, whether born here or naturalized or legal. That's who this should be about. It's about the people who pay taxes here, and whether if the immigrant is someone who pays taxes here, that's fine. And they are included in the group of who should be the poster boy for this. And I don't understand why highlighting immigrants is it. I'm not an immigrant, but I'm part of this battle. I'm a driver, so it's like I don't understand why they're trying to make that connection. Whatever. I'm going to move on from it. Setting minimum pay isn't as easy as deciding to support immigrant workers over billion-dollar corporations, however. In fact, the largely East African immigrant group of drivers advocating for minimum pay has fissured several times in recent months over the question of minimum pay. Interesting. Some supported policymakers pushing forward with higher rates despite vetoes and threats from the companies, believing Uber and Lyft are bluffing and have plenty of profit to share with their workforce. Others wish lawmakers would have passed rates more acceptable to the companies, which would have been in place for months now and are less likely to demand for rides. This is important. We're gonna look at this more in depth when we're done with this article. But a lot of people think that changes can come for free. And I don't mean just that as a monetary value. I mean that when they want change, they think that to implement change, there will be no negative associated with that change. And that's not true. And I have some examples for that. And it's not that I want it to be true, but it's the law of supply and demand. So I think I sit with these drivers. If I were there in Minnesota, this is probably where I would sit, where, hey, these demands or the counterpoints by Uber, by the governor, by the mayor, these are still significantly better than what we're dealing with right now. And they seem to be a lot more reasonable. We should do this. If you change things too much in one direction, the negatives that can be born from it, also increase. The likelihood increases. So I do think that generally speaking, a slower approach to minimum wage increases is important because it gives you time to figure out what will happen, what might happen while slowly increasing. And there have been places that have successfully done this, like New York City. And I'll touch on that in a second. But that's just something I want you to think about. At a news conference on Wednesday, Frey said his proposal of $1.20 per mile and 35 cents per minute would double driver pay, and was acceptable to the companies. The average driver right now makes about 84 cents per mile across America, across the board. It's not double the average, but I guess it's double for Minnesota. $1.20 per mile. That's pretty good. And that's the minimum, right? We're not saying that's the maximum you can earn. That's the minimum. February averaged $1.18 per mile. So I would have made even more money under their new ordinance, even though that ordinance isn't as much as what they want. I think they're being greedy. I'm sorry. I know I'm going to get comments from people saying I'm a Lyft shill, Uber shill, or, I'm for the company. I'm for fairness. And I think that this is a very fair proposal for today. Will it be fair 5 years from now? Maybe not. But I think that according to today's market, this is a very fair proposal, and they could have enacted this a year ago. I think the government's being very fair. I think Uber's being fair. But I think Uber's only being fair because the government is forcing them to do something. But I think that, this is fair. This is what public service is all about. It's about balancing a bunch of different interests for the sake of the ecosystem that is the city of Minneapolis. The ordinance authors say Frey's proposal is too low and doesn't guarantee drivers would earn the city's minimum wage of $15.57, according to a city analysis. That estimate isn't based on direct, unrestricted access to the rideshare data like the state report will be. Instead, it's based on surveys and other publicly available information. So they're not using accurate information to make their decisions on what will be what. Instead, they could have just waited a day and had access to that actual information. The new ordinance was designed under the assumption that drivers will need to spend $1.40 per mile on vehicle costs like gas, repairs, insurance, and other expenses. That's really high. I don't know what kind of cars they're driving. I feel like they're driving Bentleys out there to have that kind of level of expenses. Here's my per mile expenses for February. 23 cents per mile. They think they need $1.23 per mile. Like that's not even like what? What was it in January for me? 26 cents per mile. March right now, with me having to buy 4 new tires, it's still 26 cents per mile. They're tripping. They're tripping. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing. They have to be driving Bentleys. That's it. Their car must cost $300,000, and their gas must be the same thing. I don't understand how they decided that $1.40 per mile on vehicle costs. There's no way. They also say, and that drivers will have passengers in the car for 50% of the time they're logged onto the app, and therefore will have to earn 51 cents per minute to earn the city's minimum wage. The estimate does not account for the possibility of demand declining if the price of rides more than doubled for customers, as Lyft said it would under the rates passed by the council. During Thursday's hearing, Wansley said she wasn't persuaded by arguments that demand could be affected. That's naivism. Naivety? That's naivety. And I have some, I'm gonna back this up in a second. I have some use cases that I'm gonna share. There's no evidence that driver compensation increases were actually responsible for price increases. Yikes. Wansley said, pointing to a memo sent to the council by city staff. But that memo says increasing labor costs through minimum pay regulations do affect customer costs, although it does note that companies don't necessarily have to pass the entire cost onto customers. That's what I just said earlier. There are 2 cities that have implemented a minimum wage floor that I want to look at. One is Seattle and one is New York. We're going to look at Seattle first. Okay, so this is Gemini. I'm going to read it that Gemini may display inaccurate information, including about people, so double check its response, and we will double check these responses. So I asked it, how did the wage change affect drivers in Seattle? And it says that a study by the University of Washington found that Seattle implemented a minimum wage for rideshare drivers. Their overall earnings decreased due to reduced work hours. Some drivers ended up making less than before the wage increase. I'm gonna quickly explain kind of why that is. Supply and demand. These drivers are paid more for active time now, but because the prices were increased, less people have been ordering food. This is for food delivery. Less people have been ordering food, which decreases the amount of work available to everyone. So yes, while someone has work, they are paid more, but overall, if there's less work, then there's no money to be made. So there is a balance between supply and demand. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any floor implemented. I'm saying that we need to do it with as much accurate information as possible because they have real world ramifications on everything. Every action has a reaction, and we need to stop pretending like it doesn't. And that's why I'm upset with some of these council members who are making decisions thinking that there will be no negative ramifications. Pay us as much as we're telling you to pay us because there's no negative consequences. There is. And just because there are negative consequences doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement some of these changes. It just means we need to be way more cautious about how aggressively we implement these things. You might be thinking, oh, this is Gemini. She doesn't know what it's talking about. Well, guess what? I have a video from a city council meeting in which drivers are talking about how the bill has affected them.
Council members, my name is Bailey Medillo, and I'm a resident of District 2. I am a frequent customer of food delivery services such as DoorDash and Uber Eats, and I'm here to voice my strong support for app-based worker minimum pay law that went into effect last month. Recently, we as a community have come to notice that corporations like DoorDash are tacking on a regulatory response fee in direct response to the minimum wage pay law, which protects workers. However, it's quite clear that this response is not regulatory in nature. It is, in fact, retaliatory. When corporations take steps to protect their bottom line over worker compensation, our services suffer. We are not out of the pandemic, and accessible food services are more important than ever, even more so for people with chronic mobility issues like myself. Food delivery goes from being an issue of access to a lifeline. Minimum wage is good and necessary. These corporations' fees are backwards and harmful. Do something about that instead. And also, all of our issues are intimately connected. We can care about this and care about immigrants and refugees and everything that's going on in the world. Thank you.
Okay, so when you hear that bell, that means they have 10 seconds left to talk. So she's not a driver, but I did want to include her perspective because her perspective as a customer is important. I do think that Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, they do retaliatory things, as she does say, when laws are passed. And even though I disagree that, they shouldn't do that, right? I think it's evil. I think it's not great. They're playing like dirty. They, uh, I think it's bad, right? That's what I'm trying to say. But I'm also trying to say they play bad. So if we make changes that are too far in one direction, they're gonna make us pay for it. And now whether it's illegal, whether it's bad, whether this or that isn't my point. My point is that this is what is happening, right? They've increased prices. This person believes that they didn't need to increase the prices the way they have. And, this person is suffering as a result of it. So I did want to include that point in this. But the next two that we're going to watch are from actual drivers.
John, followed by Gary.
Under the pay up bill, we are paid 44 cents per active minute, which means the slower we work, the more we get paid. This is terrible for customers. Last week, I worked 72 hours and made $477. That's $7 an hour. That is a hardship for me, but I am super fortunate because I have options. There's a significant number of delivery workers who don't have the agency to come here and speak for themselves. They are not conventionally employable, and this type of work keeps them from being housing insecure. The communications director at Working Washington posted last week that it would be poor policymaking to repeal the pay-up bill. I ask you, how many workers need to become homeless before it is good policymaking to repeal? The longer you wait, the more people will be harmed. Timeline matters. Corporations that have never made a profit do not volunteer to pay workers more. It is irresponsible to think that they would.
That was a very mild take. It's okay. He said he worked 70 hours and made $400 and change. If that's true, possibility that some of these people are paid actors does exist, but I don't think it's likely. If you think that's the case, I'm gonna have to see some proof. Have some grains of salt when you're watching this. But from what I've looked on the internet, this is kind of what everyone is feeling. The pay it up law passed, I think, like in January, and we're starting to see the ramifications of it. This city hall meeting, whatever, this was 12 days ago. It's not that long ago. So there's one more.
Following John was Gary, followed by Justin Captis.
Good afternoon. I trust in your consideration for repealing this gig ordinance again. There were several passionate moments concerning the gig ordinance last week on the local news. Restaurants I go to every day still express their concern. Some have no idea what is going on, just that they're down 50% or whatever percent, throw out a number. To me,
Okay, so right there, he's just saying that restaurants' orders for deliveries through DoorDash have gone down about 50%. These restaurants don't really understand why. And that's, a lot of people who aren't on social media probably just aren't even aware of what's happening. I picked up people from Minnesota in my city who I'm explaining to them what's happening because they're just not aware. So it's common that people who aren't rideshare drivers aren't aware of any of this, right? So that's just, keep in mind, this isn't normal. This is just something that's huge in our small community.
The numbers I see as a boot on the ground, everyone is down. We simply need volume back. And
I will say, watch the reaction of this person back here who, as these drivers are getting up here and saying, yo, get rid of this law. This person back here supports the law, but thinks that, these companies are retaliating. So you can kind of see this person's uneasiness as these drivers are talking.
drivers, couriers, restaurants, the well-off Amazon workers not ordering anymore, we are all affected with a capital A. This is not pretense of will there be an effect. That E is definitely lowercase. Why not move on? People say, well, like the restaurants, we love this craft and we are very passionate about it. If there's a mechanism to trigger this, I hope the accounting is done expeditiously. And again, I trust in your consideration for repealing this gig ordinance.
That's pretty much all that's worth watching that I've seen. More people might come up, but they start going heavy into immigration. And then I just don't understand the connection. And I feel like I'm missing part of that conversation. But yeah, so I just want to give you a little inside scoop at how other drivers and people are actually feeling about this, because I'm about to read a study. And it was important for me to make sure you have real people's perspective before I read the study, because this study is in part done by Uber. So, the whole police force investigating itself thing. But I'm not going to hide that from you guys. I'm going to let you know that it is what it is. This is from Medium, the impact of Seattle's driver and courier pay regulations. This is from Uber Under the Hood. So it's written by something controlled by Uber. It's been out since February 22nd. So this is the earnings per online hour, 2019 versus 2023. First, I want to say I'm disappointed that they used 2019 because 2019 is an anomaly, right? Pay was great during 2019. So comparing 2019 to 2023 is a little deceiving. However, there's still something we can grasp from this. Down here, it says the rest of the US compared to Seattle in 2019. Seattle was doing fantastic per online hour at the time. Go Seattle. But now we look over here, we're seeing that the rest of the US has increased since 2019, which I think is cool if that's true, while Seattle has gone down since 2023. So, Seattle had two different ordinances that changed driver pay. One was before, like at the beginning of 2023, and one is January now. So they say that similar, after the introduction of pay up in January 2024, couriers are spending on average 30% more time waiting for delivery requests than before the ordinance went into effect. A third, 30%. We don't see a similar shift for couriers in other US markets. So that's the part I really want us to take away from this. Here's something that has changed in Seattle since this law has come out. And when we compare it to the rest of America, we haven't noticed that change. That's very important if you believe this. As a result, Seattle courier earnings during all hours online are flat to slightly down, albeit over a small sample period, which, the law went into effect January. From January till now is a small sample period. So we do need more time. We will continue looking at what's happening over there. So they're saying there's an alternative. I haven't read this deep into this article, so let's see what they're trying to sell us. Their city earning standards achieved one thing. They increased the pay of drivers and couriers for time spent on a trip. However, the resulting reduced demand has more than offset these increases. Not only did earning standards in Seattle fail to improve the welfare of earners, both standards actually hurt earners while having profoundly negative implications for merchants, restaurants, consumers, and vulnerable communities in Seattle. These outcomes were foreseeable and avoidable. Okay, now I can stick too long with this, right? Because I said there are two cities that have implemented some kind of wage floor. We had Seattle, and now we have New York. Now I think so far, New York has the best system, but I have to explain why. It says, while New York City's minimum wage rules did increase some driver earnings, the city's TNC license system acts as a key difference that affects how wage changes play out. The requirements for rideshare drivers in New York City to have a TNC plate creates artificial scarcity by limiting the number of drivers who can operate in the city. So with the TNC, I think there's only 70,000-ish plates. So there can only at any given time be 70,000 rideshare drivers. So what that does is, unlike Seattle, where they increase the minimum wage, that allows more people to come. It makes it so that more drivers are spending more time online. In addition to the fact that people are ordering less, right? So your supply of drivers is a bunch. You have a bunch of drivers now, and the amount of orders have decreased. But in New York City, even though they've enacted a minimum pay floor, because there's an artificial limit on how many people can even become drivers, it balances out. So if any city, major city, wants to enact something like this, you're going to have to follow closer in New York City's footsteps than you would in Seattle's footsteps. Can it be successful? Yes, it can. Are there other things you have to do? Yeah, you can't just stop here. So to be clear again, I'm not against minimum payment floors. I am against doing it haphazardly.